Yeah, my name is Alan Torbert, and I'm going to talk a little bit today about the enhanced efficiency fertilizer effects on cotton yield and greenhouse gas emissions. And some of the talks that we had earlier today feeds right into this because it both demonstrated the importance of nitrogen fertilizer in cotton, plus the difficulty in managing it, and that's what the development of these fertilizers is about. To start off, though, I want to say that I'm at the National Soil Dynamics Lab, and it's located right on the campus of Auburn University. But the two people I want to make sure I mention is Dr. Dexter Watts and Dr. Brett Runyon, who's really did this project. They're just letting me report on it here. There is a lot of interest in enhanced efficiency fertilizer sources to increase crop yields, while at the same time decreasing nitrogen loss from agricultural fields. So first of all, what is enhanced efficiency nitrogen fertilizer? It's either a slow release, a controlled release, or a stabilized nitrogen fertilizer. Sometimes they're shortened down to EENFs. And there's a lot of interest in developing these. The ones that we're going to look at in this experiment was environmental smart nitrogen, or ESN. It's a controlled release urea fertilizer containing a water permeable polymer coating so that the urea is slowly released over time as the water absorbs through it. There's also Agrotane Plus. This is a supplement that you put on the fertilizer that has both a urease and a nitrification inhibitor. And the Super U is a stabilized urea, and it's stabilized with the same inhibitors that they have in Agrotane. So, but also, and when you're going to talk about slow release fertilizer, I think you need to include in that organic fertilizers, and especially in Alabama where we have a huge poultry industry, we have lots of sources. Poultry litter, so we included poultry litter in the study, and also a poultry litter treated with a Agrotane applied over the top to see if the stabilizing of the poultry litter would help. So here's our treatments. We had three normal or inorganic fertilizers. We had urea ammonia sulfate, and we also had urea ammonia sulfate mixture. And if you're wondering why we had that as a mixture, it's because most of the dry fertilizer producers don't handle ammonium nitrate anymore because of the regulations required. So when you buy 34% nitrogen instead of getting ammonium nitrate, you're really getting a mixture of urea and ammonium sulfate. So we included that as part of our treatment. But then we also had the ESN, the Super U, and the poultry litter with Agrotane, and then an unfertilized control. So this is a picture of some of the granular fertilizers. So just as some background of the experiment, we did it on a coastal plain soil. It was basically at the E.V. Smith Research Center, right outside of Montgomery. It was on a Marvin loamy sand. It's a very very deep sand. It's a typical coastal plain soil. We had no-till management where we had cereal rye as our cover crop, and we applied 90 pounds per acre for all the rates were adjusted to 90 pounds of nitrogen, which is the recommended rate for cotton in Alabama. So this is just showing us planting. You can see we do support heavy residue no-till or conservation tillage planting, and we just applied all the fertilizers by hand. And we measured the yields with a spindle picker, but we also went back and did hand harvesting to get total biomass. We ginned a subsample of it, and then we also had that analyzed for fiber properties of length, Macaneer, strength, fiber length, unity, and reflectance and yellowness. So yeah, this is just a picture of us hand harvesting to get so we could get total biomass and look at nitrogen uptake. So results was you didn't see much difference probably the only, these are the 3 years of the study. We did it in 2009, 2010, 2011. 2009 was an extremely wet year, followed by 2010 was an extremely dry year. So it's good for a study like this because you got a lot of seasonal changes in there. The 2011 fit pretty much on the 30-year average. 2009 is probably 20% higher than the in-season rainfall above the 30-year average, while the 2010 was about the same below the 20-year average. So we had a big extreme difference in there, somewhat reflected in the yields that we see. But we had reasonable yield for all 3 years for our sandy land coastal plain soils. But we saw very little difference between our different treatments. The very last bar over to your right, is the control. You do see a response to applying the nitrogen, which is very difficult to pick out any other yield response from any of our fertilizer treatments. If you had the nitrogen there, it responded. And we did the same with looked at our fiber quality. We did have some differences between seasons, but they were it was hard it wasn't a lot of difference, and it was variable between years. This is the 3-year average, and it pretty well reflects what we found, which is basically very little. Probably the only thing that we did show up was a change in the ginning percentage, and that primarily we had a increase in the ginning percentage with our poultry litter treatments and our control. And we believe that is probably reflective of a lower nitrogen content. Most of the nitrogen ends up in the seed, so if you have a reduction in nitrogen, then you're likely to increase the fiber, and therefore the ginning percentage. So that's what we think reflected in that. This is primarily from the first year of the poultry litter, and we think that's because poultry litter is a very slow release. Sometimes it doesn't release very well in the first year. Multiple years, it starts having a residual effect, and we did not pick up these kinds of differences in later years, but we did see it in the first year, and over the average it showed up. But no difference in the other components. And similar, the other factors did. There was a little bit of difference between the reflectance and yellowness, but it was nothing that you could put your hat on that would show that the specialized fertilizers were giving you some kind of benefit, and none of these differences were in that range that would have been enough difference to give you where you would have been docked for the thing. So generally, the enhanced efficiency fertilizers did not show an advantage or disadvantage for yield than traditional fertilizers to cotton, and the difference in lint quality, but generally we're not in the discount range for cotton fibers. So the bottom conclusion is, at least for our coastal plain soils, the EENFs use is not likely to influence cotton yields or net return. So the next question is, what about environmental benefits? So with this, we focused on the global change component of trace gas emissions, and I'm sure all of y'all are familiar with increased CO2 and other greenhouse gases affecting the atmosphere. They absorb the heat and trap the heat in there, potentially increasing the global warming, causing global change. So the questions become then, is global warming a problem? Well, I'm not sure. I'm not here to argue one way or the other about that, but what I can say is it's certainly a political problem, and therefore it's something that we need to be concerned about. And one of the reasons why is that global change in agriculture is considered to have 20% of the total contribution of the greenhouse gases, and of that, probably 74%, most of the contributions come from either nitrous oxide or from methane, and with CO2 being kind of a balance, maybe even if you convert to no-till, it's a positive. But the methane and the nitrous oxide are definitely lead to this 20% conversion. 74% of all the nitrous oxide emissions across are contributed from agriculture. So it's a huge component of the nitrous oxide. Most of that's coming from our fertilizer. The methane is coming from rice production and from animal production, but fertilizer use is what's contributing to the nitrous oxide. And so it's a big concern. It puts a big target on the back of the fertilizer industry and anybody who uses fertilizer. And so one of the reasons why nitrous oxide is so important is its global warming potential. If you consider that the molecule of CO2 is 1, then the impact of methane is 12 times that more important. But nitrous oxide is 128. So anytime you multiply something by 128, it becomes pretty important. So it's a big deal, and that's why we were looking at it. And it's really why a lot of these fertilizer companies are interested in developing these environmentally friendly fertilizer sources to try to deal with this, the oncoming pressure that they think is coming with the increased debate about global warming. So in order for us to measure that, we used the in situ carbon dioxide chambers. These chambers, you can see that they're placed over the soil, and then the top part is just put on there when we're actually ready to make the measurement. And then we measure, take about samples over time for about 45 minutes. And then, so we just take a actual gas sample, inject it into the little vial, and then we use those little vials are measured on the gas chromatograph. We measure CO2, nitrous oxide, and methane on all our samples. And here's one you can see where we had it set up in the field and where we were ready to take the sample. We took samples on every 15 minutes for 45 minutes, starting as soon as we put the chamber closure on. We measured it at day 0, just within an hour of putting the fertilizer on, and then 2 days, 3 days, 6 days, 9 days, and 14 days after that. We did it really intensively right after fertilization, and then once a week until we harvested it, basically. And we calculated the cumulative flux was, we took each of those calculations from a day and added them all up to give us the cumulative over the growing season. And then the greenhouse potential was calculated by using those numbers I previously showed you, and then calculating the cumulative over times, basically taking into effect the increased potential of these other greenhouse gases. So results. This is for CO2, and as you can see, over time we had a steady increase of the. This is cumulative over time, so that's why they keep going up. It wasn't necessarily always higher, and you can see that that most of the treatments are stay pretty close together. The two on top are our 2 poultry litter treatments, and you can't really see any difference between the one with the agrotane applied to it. This makes sense when you think about CO2 because you're also putting on organic matter as it's decomposing, releasing that nitrogen. CO2 is being released in the decomposition process. So because that's the one treatment where we had organic matter also added, it makes sense that we'd have increased CO2. But we really couldn't see any differences between the other fertilizer treatments. And so this is our the cumulative effect of the CO2. You see in 2010 we actually had some significant differences. In most years they weren't. The other 2 years they really weren't significant. But there's really nothing to tell. It's really not even much difference between that for the CO2 and the controls, because it's not really a nitrogen driven function. It's more of a microbial CO2 decomposition function. So there's really we didn't really see any differences. The only thing that you probably could take is that you can always pick out which two as the highest for our poultry litter treatments. For the nitrous oxide, we had similar increase in older season. These tended to be driven more by rainfall. When we had a rainfall, we had a flush of the nitrous oxide. So we started out really quickly with the 2000 and the wet year. It was somewhat delayed with the drier climate that we had in 2010, but always about the same. And again, the treatments here, poultry litter tended to have the highest rate. And so the next slide, I have some of the, again, some of them averaged over the 3 years. Again, the only thing that was significant with the carbon dioxide over the 3 years was the poultry litter treatments. Nothing was actually significant. The ammonium sulfate might have been higher, but clearly the control was less than any of the other fertilizer treatment. Methane was actually, sometimes this is negative, so you actually were absorbing some of the methane. When you don't have anaerobic conditions like you do in rice, you can actually absorb some of the methane. But it's hard to even though they were significant, to figure out any kind of trend or say that there was any kind of real impact from the methane. And so the global warming potential basically came out that there was no impact from our different fertilizer treatments. The control, the one I think I should say is that even though the CO2 was the most important factor, I guess because of the level of CO2 that's being emitted, it was the driving factor for the total global warming potential. It looks like the control was less, but it was not significantly different than our urea ammonium sulfate or our ESN treatment. One was a normal fertilizer, one was an efficiency treatment, so you really can't say there's anything there. Maybe that you could say poultry litter had a higher global warming potential than the control. So I would say that the conclusion is that the emissions increase following rainfall. The CO2 is still the driving force, but one thing you have to remember about CO2 is that it's balanced by increased biomass of the plant, so it's what's not reflected in here is that it's a balance of carbon going back into the soil. And then in poultry litter applications to cotton, increase greenhouse gas fluxes compared to the other fertilizer sources. But the difference between the fluxes, between the nitrogen sources were minimal, and there was basically the EENFs did not provide any environmental advantage over standard inorganic fertilizer sources applied to cotton in this humid southeastern U.S. region. I guess I'd give a couple of caveats for this. One is, since it was cotton, we were only applying 90 pounds per acre. If you were in a crop that was more responsive to nitrogen, like corn, you might get a better yield response to these, and maybe it would take with more nitrogen, you would pick up some difference from these other gases. But we didn't see it in cotton. And the other thing is that we applied all of the nitrogen treatments at first square to be efficient with our application. And if you had a slow release, that might not be necessary. You may be able to put it out at planting. And so if you had different timings of the application, that might make a difference in how these reacted. But overall, I would say it would not be beneficial to spend extra money on these fertilizers for reasons. So I'll answer questions. If you want more details, these two publications have the recently released that cover both the yield components and the global change warming, the trace gas works, and with that, I'll answer any questions.
How much more do these enhanced efficiency fertilizers cost, I guess, say
You know, I'm not really sure now. One of the things that's different, you know, the slow release has been used for a long time. It's very well established in like the horticulture industry, but those are high value crops that where the nitrogen fertilizer is a small part of the overall cost, and having this slow release is a bigger benefit to them. What these particular brands that we're looking at was actually attempts to reduce the cost to the point where it makes it reasonable for somebody to use it in corn or cotton. And so they're cheaper than what you would buy for, you know, for a horticulture crop, but I really don't know what the going rate is. I should have looked that up before I came.
Do you think the slow release would be more beneficial as you go into higher yield levels in terms of the efficiency of nitrogen, kind of spoon feeding the nitrogen through the year?
It could, and that's why I think in something like corn, where you've got a more direct response and you don't have this top end where there's no need in putting more nitrogen on, and having it available right when it needs it, that it could help the efficiency, but we didn't see it in corn, and corn's only been grown with the increase in grain prices in these coastal plain soils. Unless you got irrigation, it's a very risky thing to do, but that's why we looked at cotton.
Did y'all apply all that material on top of the ground?
Yeah, we did. It was all.
How long after that did you get a rain on that?
It depended on the year, but
that would have made a big difference. So with the retain on there. I know in rice, I'm more rice than cotton. That we've been using it through the years because we lose a lot of our nitrogen. Say if we catch a rain before we get a whole big field flooded or something, it seems to have been paying off for us.
It definitely is driven by the rain, as far as the trace gas emissions. I don't think that we would have enough rain that would have, unless you have a runoff event, you're not going to lose it over the land, and if you got to have a lot of rain to have a leaching problem. So I don't think that would be a big issue, but it certainly is. It certainly would drive the impacts of the trace gas work. But we can't predict the rainfall, so we put it on at first square.
How much is the poultry litter currently being used in the areas where they have the big poultry production? Oh,
they use all of the poultry litter. It's a commodity that's the issue with the poultry litter is it's not that they don't want to use it, and they use it primarily in pasture. Because those areas where they have the poultry houses are also areas where it's not very good for row crop production, not the best soils. So they have pasture, and so if you look at a map of Alabama, you'd see where you have the highest poultry production. You also have the highest cow-calf operations because they're taking that litter. And the issue with poultry litter is it becomes an environmental hazard for phosphorus runoff and in overuse, and so. But with the nitrogen costs going up, they've been shipping a lot more of it to production areas and utilizing it. But it's not a question of they look at it as part of their the litter becomes part of their production assets, and they either use it themselves, which they would prefer because it costs them, or they sell it and they don't have any trouble getting rid of it.
So in Tennessee, we've got guys that maybe they want to use Agritain, but they don't want to pay for it on the UAN or urea. Do you have interest on applying it to poultry litter? And what quantities are you having applied to poultry litter?
Well, that's what we did. We applied it to the poultry litter, but we didn't really find any advantage to do it.
Are you seeing, are producers asking about it? It seems
no.
like you have to apply a lot to the poultry, just because it's such a large quantity.
Yeah. Well, we applied it. We applied the litter and then applied it on the ground at the recommended rate.
Okay.
And so we didn't change it we didn't mix it ahead of time. We just applied the litter at the rate that you would, for the 90 pounds per acre, and then apply the adjuvant chain on
Oh,
top,
understood.
over the top.
I understood, okay.
But no, I haven't heard anybody, any of the
Okay.
farmers really asking for it. And I don't know that it was something that, you know, the poultry litter is a big part of our research program, so that was part of our motivation for including it. But it's already a slow release fertilizer if you think about it, so it probably doesn't have a lot of applicability unless we did find some of this nitrous oxide reduction, which in fact we didn't, and it's not a good story for poultry litter application anyway.
I've seen some work where they talk about that it has its own slow release, I mean, just by the nature.
Yeah.
Is it used by organic farmers?
The
poultry litter?
Oh, yeah.
Is preferred over, you know,
I don't know that I'd say it was preferred. It's just in Alabama, it's the most common. You know, we there's enough poultry litter produced to fertilize every acre in the state. So,
okay.
but and it's by far the other areas like in Texas, you have big dairy operations, and so dairy manure becomes a bigger operation. But it's the 800-pound gorilla in Alabama as far as how much well, for all agriculture, it produces half the ag income for the whole state is poultry production.
And like Iowa now, it's hog manure.
Okay, hog manure, yeah. And some of those are really harder to deal with because a lot of times they're liquid based and harder to
From a
make.
farmer standpoint, it's freight issue, you know, how close are you to
Get
the
the opposite.
poultry house? And you want it, if you don't have to haul it too far, you know, it's pretty economical.
Yeah, and it has value other than just the nitrogen. You know, it does have you're putting organic matter.
Especially on farm land.
Yeah, and you get it has other micronutrients. You get all your nutrients. You don't not just nitrogen. It's just nitrogen. It's the most expensive and most needed, and therefore that's the rate they go with. Anything else? Well, I appreciate y'all being hardy enough to stay and listen to us. And